Thank you, Steve. I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk about this topic because I think it's a really interesting topic and has some particular resonance in Canada. And the future, I'm going to try to set the stage, if you like, for the proper nuclear weapon-free zone discussion, to just talking about what's going on in the Arctic and why it's there. Okay, I want you to think about this map. We can bring it back off and on, but this is, if you look at it from the North Pole, this is the North Pole, and all of the surrounding states. You know, Canada, as you can see it, the U.S. in Alaska, a huge periphery of the Arctic Ocean with the Soviet Union. We also have a little tiny bit of Iceland, and we also have the Norway and Denmark as nations on the Arctic Ocean, and then Arctic nations above the Arctic Circle, and that's what we're talking about here as Arctic. Also Sweden and Finland. So those are the circumpolar nations. Okay. Okay. So can everyone hear me now that you finished looking at the map? So this is what we want to be thinking about. The first thing, the polar ice is melting because there is climate change, or vice versa. The polar ice melting also causes climate change. I mean, what happens in the Arctic is not isolated from the entire rest of the world. The land, the sea, the ice, they're all part of what makes the climate right here today and all over the world. So it's not just them. And furthermore, what are we supposed to do about this as a global community? Adapt? Cooperate? We hope so. But, you know, there's other forces at work, so we must kind of think about that. Now, I'm sure you've been reading the newspapers, but just think about this. The annual ice cover has disappeared very, very rapidly. Now, I don't have a pointer here, so I guess you'll just have to look at the picture. But the fact is that we've got data up to, say, 2000. And there's a big periphery there of lots of ice. Then there's 2005, and then there's 2007, and it keeps disappearing. But that's just the ice that's going away. If you look more closely at it, you discover, and what's happening is there's multi-year ice and the big thick stuff and the single-year ice. And there's a lot more of the one-year ice. That means it melts in the summer and it disappears, and then it comes back in the winter. So that just looking at ice cover isn't the whole story. There's a lot more to think about there. And when you lose a lot of multi-year ice, you're definitely on the way to losing the Arctic ice. Now, we know that we're going to get navigation in the summer Arctic seas, but that's a huge challenge. Now, there's two ways of going across the new Mediterranean, as some would have called it, or there's the Northwest Passage, and in Canada we've all heard a lot about that, so we can kind of relate to that. But there's also the Northern Sea Route. That's the route, back a little bit. Maybe we should just have the, oops, sorry. The Northern Sea Route is, in fact, across essentially the Soviet Union route, and that's the already more kind of developed. Anyway, you would get then, because of that, offshore oil production, industrial transport, all on this huge, gigantic Arctic Ocean. You'd have to have a support network, ports, well-spaced, well-equipped. Some of them are in process, but not in the Canadian Arctic. Navigation charts, coastal pilots, surveillance of ice conditions, lots of things necessary, emergency services, shipping controls, regulations. You need to have search and rescue. You need to be dealing with oil spills. You need to have ice-capable ships and experienced crews to run them. And so we've got this sort of gigantic environmental challenge, how to maintain the Arctic Ocean and the shores in a pristine state. So not only that, we have also, oops, keep going here. No, there. Okay, well, what sort of a list, very quickly if possible here, of the consequences of Arctic climate change are simply, I think I've lost my place, but I'll find, yeah, here it is. Well, of course, it's a new frontier for resource development and exploration. Lots of commercial interest there. There's the International Law of the Sea, which will resolve sovereignty claims on the continental shelves. You'll hear more about that, I'm sure, from the others. And navigation routes open in summer seas. Commercial shipping, new opportunities for tourism. The fisheries will change and there'll be commercial shipping. Habitat and species and complex food supply webs will totally change. And they'll change it so rapidly that it's hard to cope. Ocean shores will change. Lakes, rivers, glaciers will alter. And coastal flooding will make a lot of the areas that are presently inhabited uninhabitable. So, and wildlife habitat will all change. And permafrost melting, if you want to really start worrying about this, will accelerate production of greenhouse gases and cause massive infrastructure problems on, say, like pipelines, which are, destroyed by permafrost problems. And everybody in that Arctic Circumpolar group is likely to increase their military presence. Meaning of that is to be determined. Now, so if we then think of just one example, fisheries and marine life. It's a new hazardous frontier for commercial shipping. The extent of the fishery stock is in fact unknown. Conditions for the nutrients, not uniform. Overfishing is entirely possible, just like other oceans will be overfished. Yes, there's lots of fish there, but where are they and which are the good areas? And then there will be lots of new species and new diseases, and temperature changes and acidity increases. And so generally, this is a kind of difficult situation. I'm going to give you one example here of, don't seem to be really good at. I keep going backwards, sorry. I told you really what will happen in the habitat and food supply, not to mention that tree lines won't advance like you think they might. There's a big issue about whether there's any Arctic soils of interest. I just don't, okay. Adaptation is the big thing. We all here talk about going to Copenhagen and doing mitigation things. Well, of course, this helps over a sort of longer term, but what happens over the short term, things that are happening now and in the relatively near future, this is a big adaptation situation. So it requires huge resources. And the Arctic peoples, of course, need to have some support in that work that's being done. Essentially, you need jointly developed things by Arctic peoples and their governments. You have to think about sustainability paramount. You have to think there will be environmental refugees from coastal regions. That's another adaptation from sea culture to land culture. Youth in that area will have to be educated to a totally different kind of way of living. Territorial jurisdiction will have to require indigenous peoples to plan for increased military presence, and traditional knowledge can hopefully be used. Now, I'm giving you one example of adaptation, which is a brand new one. I just sort of discovered this in recent times, a sort of interesting picture on the trails of the Inuit. Apparently, what happened here is that there was a thought that you could provide GPS for hunters that are going out in the huge territories in Nunavut. And in fact, the GPS had attached to their snowmobiles or their dog sleds. And it started with kind of University of Calgary, and it started somewhat with a polar ice year and others. And we find that they had a terrifically interesting experience in taking these small GPS units out into the polar regions. But they started in 2006. The first fielding of a 6-month trial was 2008. 2009, they had learned a whole lot of stuff in 2008, and maybe 2009 they're working on it, and now what they've got is, over time, an extremely valuable way of finding out where are the caribou, where's the weak ice, where are all sorts of weather conditions, all sorts of important stuff that they use and the scientific community uses together. So the lesson about this is you need northerners, southerners together. It takes longer than you think, and you have to keep on supporting it. And you need lots of resources. And Steve has told me I should hurry up, but I'm not too far from the end, I think. A couple of pictures of Arctic research taking place in Norway. But just think, whatever's happening, the harsh environment requires major adaptations of new technologies. Don't underestimate what will happen there. And so this will really change things. And at the same time, there's a lot of activity in increased military operations. And so, of course, sovereign territory protection and work on that can actually be helpful in opening the Arctic if that was the slant on things. But the two circumpolar nations are, as you remember from the map, are Arctic nations, and they're also nuclear weapons nations. This makes it really difficult because the other nuclear weapon-free zones have not had quite such horrendous challenges with respect to that. But if they went forward to that, it would be a major step in an indication of true intent in nuclear disarmament. So it's a new frontier, new challenges. Military conflict really needs to be renounced because there are other things that are much more important to be doing in the Arctic. I just wanted to quote Franklin Griffith, who is here today, and he has a lot of information about the Arctic in many papers that he's written. But I think one of the observations he made, should change favor conflict, the region as a whole will suffer, and risks of strategic rivalry and all manner of collaboration will be foregone. So we don't really want that, and we see that we could have an expanded mandate for the Arctic Council. We could expand programs for adaptation. We could necessarily have lots more scientific data, and you could have a scientific commission on the Arctic research. Antarctic has such a thing. The UN Law of the Sea will be continuing to operate its major for this, and agreements can be regional or national or even Arctic treaty, but apparently the Arctic polar nations are not very interested in an Arctic treaty. They think that it would be interference with their own work. Concluding, the climate affects the global climate. That's all there is to it. And adaptation is a massive challenge. And we need huge international resources to bring forward and to get this successful opening of the Arctic. And humanity simply doesn't possess the funds or the resources or the people to do both. So we have to choose not military and not conflict, because that's not going to be possible to do both. And so we need collaboration, and what we need, if at all possible, is the seeds of planting a nuclear weapon-free zone. Every time an agreement is made about anything, whether it be environmental or some other topic, it should also include the idea that sooner or later it will be a nuclear weapon-free zone. I think you could put the map back up.